an exercise in high jump or limbo. Maybe limbo is the way we'll go. So or at the end of the conference, I should really first to say how much I've immensely enjoyed working gathering. I'm very grateful to have been invited, very grateful to the people who organized. One of the great things about this particular gathering and gatherings like it is it's given me the chance to reconnect with some very dear old friends, and it's given me the chance to make some new friendships. And in that sense, I like the enterprise. So I'm very, very grateful. Another thing about a conference like this is that it forces participants to write papers that they otherwise wouldn't write. And think about things that, or in some ways are kind of a luxury to think about. Thinking about methodology is taking a step back and in some ways not always doing your day job. Or maybe it is your day job, but you're always working nighttime or something. Killing that metaphor. And actually, one thing that was interesting about this project is I think a lot of the papers that I'm citing to were written for a conference like this.
Really?
Yeah. Well, a bunch of luminaries like us who got together and kind of reflected on the field and reflected about methodology and in that sense, the bar really is high. Another thing about a conference like this is that sometimes it means that papers get written that shouldn't be written at all. And I mean that in a fairly serious way. I'm not sure I have a paper. I have a reflection of ideas. I hope it leads to a great discussion. I'm not committed to actually putting it in print. I'm very eager to hear feedback to see how it actually might amount to some kind of contribution. So I'm talking about what I'm calling Williamson's charge. I was a student of Oliver Williamson, and one of his mantras was you should always ask what's going on out there. In a conference about methodology, it just seemed very appropriate, and in many ways a really cool opportunity to dig past that. Not just report that he kept telling us but where did it come from and what impact did it have? And maybe I'll start at the end. I kind of thought that many of his students and contemporaries were like me and really took the phrase to heart so much that they repeated it themselves. And this was, I mentioned this paper, this is me doing what Coe says you shouldn't be. I had a theory that I was testing because I believed in it already. I thought that lots of people would use this quote in different pieces of work, and it'd be really interesting to gather them all together and to see what those pieces of work were. I was one of the few people who actually quoted it. I saw the charge reflected in lots of other people's work, but it was more tenuous. And the original idea I had about the paper, which is let's basically do a find and search and some kind of literature review, didn't easily emerge. So instead, I was more open-ended. Maybe I'm going meta. I was saying, what's going on out there as it relates to the phrase of what's going on out there. And
the turtles.
it's a little bit like the turtles, yeah. I guess there are two main lessons or two main insights. One is thinking about the connection between the charge and Williamson's own education, something he also talked about a great deal, his time at Carnegie Mellon, which he often called the Carnegie connection. The way he describes it, and others have written about it, but I think he really is the one who's written about it most frequently. It just seemed like a really special place, where there were lots of social scientists doing lots of generative work. There were economists at every table, and they were kind of a gadfly of the other social sciences. But at the same time, they were also incorporating a lot of the lessons that the other social sciences were generating into economic theory. There was a lot of really seminal work in, I think, any field, the way you describe it, economics, sociology, political science. But also there was an enormous amount of seminal work in what I guess is called the science of organization, the theory of organization. March's work came out of that. A lot of work, some work in corporate law and corporate governance came out of that school. And, you know, I haven't done a survey, but my sense is that there are very few other educational and intellectual environments that are structured that way. And in that sense, it is kind of an opportunity to look at a fairly unique intellectual and academic setting, and to think what kind of methodological lessons have been passed on and how we might be able to sustain them, even if we have a political economy of the university that doesn't lend itself to creating those kinds of settings very much. I guess another lesson also is this constant theme that was not only in Williamson's work, but also in Robert Solo's work. Williamson, of course, takes Solo's phraseology, but he kind of generated it himself independently. Coase used a similar phraseology. Solo, in other work, made similar comments. So you have this theme among very prominent economists that are kind of expressing both a little bit of an admiration but also a frustration with the trajectory of traditional economics, where it is very model-bound, and it's not just the kind of critique that Roe brought early on in this conference, that you're assuming away much of the rich context, but the model kind of frames the academic enterprise. And in many ways, the literature has trouble, the scholar has trouble getting outside of the model. And, you know, this has some short-term costs. It doesn't lend itself to the best scholarship, but then it has, I think this is what Solo is saying, it has some long-term costs, which is that the trajectory of scholarship is a little too linear. And to get outside the model, to encourage people, graduate students, to not be bound by established templates, there is this question, maybe you should just look what's going on out there. Part of this is an internal critique of economics. Solo, in many ways, has some really interesting things to say about economic history and how economic historians, at one point, serve a really valuable counterpoint, offering context in a lot of ways to economic scholarship. Williamson originally borrowed the phrase from an anthropologist, kind of thinking that the methodology employed by anthropologists could be really useful in economics. You know, just doing participant observation, literally just looking at seeing what's going on there. And then you also see some other interesting, I think, political dynamics in writings about Coase, where on one hand, and Frank Knight also, both of them in many ways were creators and leaders of the Chicago School, but they also were real critics of the Chicago School. So not only do you see that tension happening within the field, but you actually also see it within a single department. So maybe those are two lessons or two insights, something about Carnegie and something about economics. And maybe, you know, I'll return to where I started, which is I'm not sure I have a paper here, but if I do, I would love to get some help in trying to figure out how it could be a contribution. And I'll also appreciate, express some appreciation for Sharon for making sure that we wore the same outfit. I mean,